All right, let's dive straight into this explainer. Today we're cutting through all the cultural noise, the opinions, and the rapidly shifting laws to look strictly at the clinical data on how cannabis actually impacts the human body. Because here's the thing, the cannabis being consumed today, it is definitely not the same plant from decades ago. We are talking about a massive leap from the 2 or 3% THC concentrations of the Woodstock era to dispensary strains sitting at 25% and concentrates pushing an absolute mind-blowing 90%. That massive shift in potency literally changes the biological game, which brings us to the core focus of our explainer. Is weed smoking really that bad?
To figure that out objectively, here's our roadmap. We'll start with the modern cannabis question, then look at its impact on the heart, move up to the brain and mental health, dive into a wild paradox involving the gut, and finally assess the real bottom-line risks.
Okay, Section 1, the modern cannabis question.
With cannabis becoming so incredibly normalized right now, and strains getting wildly potent, we really have to ask what the data actually says. Is it just a harmless herb, a dangerous narcotic, or, as you might expect, something much more complex? Because today's marijuana is exponentially stronger, the clinical data we have right now is painting a highly specific, deeply detailed, and honestly sometimes very surprising picture of what's going on inside our biology.
There's this brilliant quote from Dr. Lester Grinspoon, a legendary specialist out of Harvard Medical School, that perfectly captures the medical paradox we're looking at today. Basically, he points out that while cannabis isn't the absolute poison it was once claimed to be by early anti-drug campaigns, for instance, large-scale studies still haven't firmly linked it to lung cancer in the exact same way they have with tobacco, it is definitely far from being completely benign. It carries severe, sometimes life-altering risks for specific people. So the modern clinical approach? It isn't about slapping an entirely good or entirely bad label on the plant. It's about understanding exactly who is using it, how much they're using, and the unique underlying vulnerabilities of their specific body.
Let's move to Section 2, impact on the heart.
Naturally, when we think of smoking and heart health, we immediately default to the tobacco model, right? Well, a massive systematic review of 18 different studies compared the two, and the physiological mechanisms of damage are actually entirely different. Tobacco is famous for its slow, chronic burn. It damages the endothelial lining over decades, slowly building up plaque. Cannabis, on the other hand, the data shows it has a distinctly acute short-term way of causing damage. The sudden, intense stimulation of cannabinoid receptors in your cardiovascular system can trigger immediate vasospasms, which are sudden constrictions of your blood vessels, alongside extreme rapid spikes in heart rate and blood pressure right after consumption.
And guys, this timeline is staggering. Research indicates that in 80% of studied cannabis-induced heart attack cases, otherwise totally healthy young men presented with symptoms within just 6 hours of consumption. 6 hours! Picture a 31-year-old walking into the ER, clutching his chest, having a full-blown myocardial infarction. He has absolutely no other risk factors. No diabetes, no high cholesterol, not overweight, but that acute massive surge of cardiovascular stress triggered by high-potency THC, it was literally enough to induce a sudden cardiac event. It's an immediate shock to the system, rather than a slow deterioration.
That brings us to Section 3, the brain and mental health.
Let's look at a massive longitudinal study out of New Zealand. They followed nearly 1,000 people from age 3 all the way to age 45. It's an incredible data set, and it revealed that heavy, long-term cannabis users experienced an average IQ decline of 5.5 points by midlife compared to their childhood baseline. Now, to put that into perspective, a 5.5-point drop isn't just a slightly lower test score. It translates to real-world friction. It means struggling with complex problem-solving at work, having a much harder time retaining new info, or dealing with a seriously impaired working memory. MRIs of these patients even showed a visibly shrinking hippocampus. That's the brain's learning and memory center. And get this, friends and family of these users independently reported noticing those exact memory and attention problems in their everyday interactions.
But wait, what happens when high-potency THC meets a brain that is still actively developing? Well, the psychiatric risks go through the roof. Studies show a stark 40% higher risk of developing psychosis, particularly for adolescents. You see, a teenager's endocannabinoid system is still laying down the neural architecture for the rest of their life. So introducing exogenous, high-potency THC drastically alters how the prefrontal cortex forms. That's the brain's command center for judgment and decision-making. This leads to measurable increases in impulsivity and risk-taking well into adulthood. Intoxicated users have also been found in lab settings to be highly susceptible to generating false memories, which is wild. completely blurring the line between what actually happened and what they just imagined happened.
Let's shift gears to Section 4, the paradox of the gut.
So, THC is famously prescribed in clinical settings to cure nausea, right? It's widely and effectively used for patients going through harsh treatments like chemotherapy to help them keep food down. Yet long-term, daily use of high-potency strains can completely flip this physiological switch. It actually alters the way motility molecules in the gut function and fundamentally changes how the stomach empties. The result is honestly one of the most surprising medical paradoxes in recent years, a devastating condition called cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, or CHS. The exact substance known to cure nausea suddenly becomes the very trigger for unrelenting vomiting.
Because of the explosion of high-strength cannabis on the market, an astonishing 33% of frequent users visiting the emergency department are now presenting with CHS symptoms. And to be clear, this isn't just a mild stomachache or feeling a little woozy. This is a severe, debilitating, cyclical illness that drives people to the ER in intense abdominal agony. These patients are often showing up with severe clinical dehydration, needing immediate IV fluids and intensive medical intervention just to stabilize their core vitals.
This syndrome actually progresses through 3 very distinct steps. It kicks off at the prodromal phase, featuring persistent early morning nausea and a growing fear of eating. Then it ramps up into the hyperemetic phase, which is just intense, overwhelming vomiting that can literally last for hours or even days. Fascinatingly, sufferers discover almost universally that taking continuous scalding hot showers provides temporary relief. The extreme heat basically overloads the sensory nerves, distracting the nervous system and the brain's hypothalamus from those nausea signals. But the absolute hardest part for patients to accept is step 3. Because they still view cannabis as the ultimate cure for nausea, they often try to smoke more to fix the vomiting. But a cure is only possible by completely stopping all cannabis use. The body's endocannabinoid receptors need a total reset. Cutting back doesn't work, it has to be absolute cessation.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, assessing the real risks.
So, let's go back to our main question. Is weed smoking really that bad? Well, the modern medical consensus says it depends entirely on who you are. While casual, low-potency use might not cause long-term issues for a typical healthy adult, certain populations absolutely must avoid the drug. For teenagers, it physically and permanently alters brain development. For pregnant or breastfeeding women, there is zero evidence that it is safe, with known risks for fetal development and birth weight. And for anyone with a family history of psychosis, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia, cannabis can act as the direct biological trigger that unearths and exacerbates those exact psychiatric conditions.
But hey, there is some incredibly hopeful news for those worried about dependence or cognitive decline. Harvard researchers note that many of these cognitive symptoms, like the intense brain fog or working memory issues, are actually highly reversible if users follow evidence-based steps. They recommend a slow taper over several weeks rather than quitting cold turkey to minimize withdrawal. You really have to give it time. THC is lipophilic, meaning it binds to fat cells, so it can take up to a full month to fully metabolize out of your system. During that window, they suggest using cognitive tracking apps to objectively measure your progress so you don't lose hope, and getting regular aerobic exercise, which is proven to stimulate neurogenesis and help rapidly rebuild that brain function.
As we wrap up this explainer, the science really is clear. Cannabis is a complex, highly potent biological agent. It's just not biologically harmless, especially for the young, the pregnant, and the psychiatrically vulnerable. So as the cultural narrative pushes further toward total normalization, we're left with a critical question. Are we letting this shifting culture blind us to the undeniable objective clinical data? And perhaps even more importantly, with these hyper-potent strains literally everywhere, are we truly equipping the next generation with the clinical facts they need to protect their own minds and bodies?